Welcome back to another episode of Mathematical Minutes with Mrs. Ross. This week we're going to be talking about non-standard and standard units of measurement. Right, so this week, the first thing we're going to talk about is non-standard units of measurement. And you may have actually used these and you didn't even realize you were doing it. If you've ever measured the length of a room by putting your heel to your toe and walking across to see how many feet it was, you've used non-standard units of measure. This week, we're going to practice with using some that I found around the house. So I have just a few that you might be familiar with. I have some of those Unifix cubes that we've used in class. I have some paper clips, and I have some Legos. Now, the most important thing that we need to remember with non-standard units of measure is that we have to make sure that we're using repeated objects. Our repeated objects have to be identical, which means they have to be in exactly the same size as the other one so that we can get the most accurate measurement that we can. So in just a moment, I'm going to show you how we can use these everyday items to measure some things around the house. We can use our non-standard units of measure to measure things around the house. So I've taken 3 different items and I've lined them up so that I have the longest to the shortest. Depending on what I use as my non-standard unit of measure, my measurement might change a little bit, but there's always one thing that's true when we use these units. Whenever we line up the units with our object, we want to make sure that we go from the furthest points on the object, but we also have to make sure that those units are touching each other. No gaps, because that's going to change the way that we measure. And they also can't overlap. So you can see that I have Legos that are exactly the same length. They are touching each end. And we can get a non-standard measurement for the scissors. So looking at what I have, I see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My scissors are about 7 Legos long. I can use the same strategy using lots of different non-standard measurements. Paper clips. If I measure my marker with the paper clips, I'm going to use the same strategy. I'm going to start at the very end of the marker. I'm going to make sure that my paper clips are touching. They're not overlapping and there are no gaps. Using my non-standard unit of measure, I can say that my Sharpie is 4 paper clips long. Even for tiny objects like this little car here, I can use a non-standard unit of measure for that as well. If I put 1 block down, I can tell that that's not quite it. But if I do 2, I can see that my tiny race car is just about 2 blocks long. Now, depending on what kind of non-standard unit measure we use, we might get different objects. So for example, this car is 2 blocks, but if I were to use a different unit, like my paper clip, it's only 1 paper clip long. Now, this can become a problem when we're trying to explain our thinking to other people who aren't using the same non-standard units that we are. But fortunately, we have something else that we can use that can help us to measure even more accurately. We talked a little bit earlier about how to use those non-standard units to measure things. And we know that that means that we're using a repeated object, identical objects, and we're making sure that there are no gaps or overlaps between them. But there can be downfalls to using this kind of measurement system because not everyone might be familiar with the unit that you're using. In that case, we do have some tools that are widely recognized and that people know how to use all over the world. This week we're going to talk about inches as our standard unit of measurement, and I brought a few tools with me to show you that we can use different kinds of tools to measure different things with our inches. This is a tape measure. This tape measure is very flexible. You can use it for measuring things that are round. People use it when they're making different types of clothing. This is another kind of tape measure that you might have seen around your house when people are doing projects. This also has those inches on it as the standard unit of measure, but it also has centimeters, which is something that we'll talk about later. In addition to that, I have a meter stick. The meter stick has inches on one side and centimeters on the other. This is great for measuring things that are a little bit bigger in the room. But we're really going to focus on using our ruler. This is a 12-inch ruler. I didn't have anything fancy, so I printed this one off the internet and just put it on some cardboard. But we're going to see how we can use the inches on this ruler in the same way that we used our non-standard units of measure to find out the lengths of the objects that we used earlier. Let's take a closer look at our ruler. And we talked about our non-standard units of measurement being repeated objects. With our inch ruler, it's the same idea. Each one of our inches is exactly the same size. And if you notice, where the last one leaves off, the next one picks up. No gaps, no overlapping. We can use this tool to help us to measure things more accurately. A standard unit of measure is a measure that was designed specifically to measure things. So if we take a look at our scissors, one thing I want to take a look at on my ruler is that I see this dash with the 0. I have to be really careful depending on what ruler and what measuring tool I'm using, because sometimes For example, with my meter stick here, the measurement begins right here at the end. So right here at the end of my meter stick is the 0. So if I were measuring objects with this, I would start the measurement right there. But if you look closely at our ruler, you'll notice that it doesn't begin measuring right at the end. It begins just slightly in. So we want to make sure that the end of our object is lined up with that dash. So with measuring my scissors, since that's kind of a tricky shape, I want to measure from the furthest point to the furthest point. And if I look at my measurement, I can see I'm just past my 8, I'm almost to the 9. So I can say that my scissors are about 9 inches long. I can use the same strategy when I measure my Sharpie. Remember that I want to make sure that I line up my Sharpie or my object right there where my ruler begins measuring. My Sharpie is about 5 inches long. And now down here for my tiny car, I want to line it up the same way. That little car is just about 1 inch long. So now if I wanted to communicate this to anyone who knows how to measure in inches, they would understand exactly what I was talking about. So just to recap, non-standard units of measure are repeated identical objects to measure the length of things. Standard units of measure are things like our inches, using specific tools like rulers and tape measures to measure more accurately with our objects. So join us next week for another episode of Mathematical Minutes, where we'll be exploring telling time. Say goodbye, Ella.